They say your home is supposed to be your safe place, your escape from the chaos of the world. But what happens when the real chaos is waiting right outside your front door? One homeowner thought they had found their dream neighborhood until the HOA decided to turn their life into a nightmare. Petty fines, secret meetings, and threats that felt more personal than professional. Each step was designed to break them down. However, when the HOA overstepped its bounds, the homeowner fought back in a way no one had anticipated. Would you have done the same? When the Martins first moved into Willow Creek, they thought they had finally found the place they could call home forever. The neighborhood looked like it had been pulled from a magazine. Trimmed lawns, fresh paint on every house, and kids riding bikes down the cul-de-sac without a care in the world. It was the kind of picture-perfect setting you'd imagine when someone says, "The American Dream." For a while, that dream felt real. The Martins kept to themselves, friendly enough with the neighbors, but not the type to get involved in every block party or weekend barbecue. They weren't flashy people. Daniel Martin worked long hours as a paramedic, often gone at odd hours, while his wife, Sarah, balanced raising their 2 kids with working part-time from home. Their house wasn't the biggest on the street, but they kept it clean, tidy, and welcoming. At first, the HOA seemed harmless enough. The occasional newsletter slipped into the mailbox, the annual fee that went toward landscaping, and the smiling committee members waving at community events. It felt like a small price to pay for living in such a neat and orderly place. Sarah even commented one evening that it was reassuring to know the neighborhood had standards. But behind that veneer of order was something else, something they didn't see until it was too late. The first sign came in the form of a letter. It wasn't hostile, not exactly, but the wording carried a certain sharpness, as if someone had been watching just a little too closely. Please ensure your trash bins are removed from the curb within 2 hours of pickup to maintain community standards. The Martins brushed it off. They had been a bit late one morning, no big deal. But then another letter came, and another. Each time, the violations grew more specific. A small patch of grass near the driveway wasn't uniform in color. A garden hose was left coiled on the side of the yard instead of being tucked neatly away. Even the family's mailbox, according to the HOA, wasn't painted the approved shade of white. Sarah started to feel uneasy. She couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching them, waiting for any slip-up, no matter how small. The neighborhood that once felt so welcoming now carried an edge of hostility, like every smile from across the street was hiding judgment. Daniel, exhausted from late-night shifts, didn't think much of it at first. "It's just paperwork," he told her. "They'll get bored and move on." But the letters didn't stop. They multiplied, stacking up on the kitchen counter like a growing list of petty grievances. It wasn't just the letters either. The Martins began to notice glances from neighbors, lingering looks that weren't exactly friendly. A car was slowing as it passed their home. A whisper of conversation that ended the moment Sarah stepped outside. What started as mild irritation slowly twisted into a constant weight pressing on the family. Every trip to the grocery store, every walk to the mailbox, carried the tension of wondering what would be waiting next. And then one day, Sarah spotted the head of the HOA, Karen, a woman who wore her title like a crown, standing across the street, arms crossed, staring directly at their house. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't waving. She was inspecting. That was when Sarah knew this wasn't about community standards anymore. Something deeper, something personal, was brewing in Willow Creek. And the Martins were about to find out just how far the HOA was willing to go to keep their neighborhood perfect. At first, the Martins tried to play by the rules. Daniel repainted the mailbox the approved shade of white, a color so indistinguishable from what they already had that even their next-door neighbor couldn't tell the difference. Sarah kept a meticulous eye on the lawn, watering it daily, trimming edges with care, even asking Daniel to fix the small patch of grass that looked too dry in the HOA's eyes. But the letters didn't stop. Instead, they grew more aggressive. The language shifted from pleas and friendly reminders to fines and threats of legal action. One day, Sarah opened an envelope to find a $250 citation for unauthorized decorative objects. She blinked, confused. Before realizing what it referred to, her daughter had placed a small ceramic owl on the porch, a gift from her grandmother. The HOA declared it out of alignment with community guidelines. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the fine print. If they didn't remove it immediately, additional fines would compound daily. It felt absurd. A harmless decoration had suddenly been elevated to a violation worthy of punishment. When Daniel got home from his overnight shift, he laughed bitterly, shaking his head. A ceramic owl? That's what they're worried about? But the laughter didn't last. The next week, another letter arrived. This time, it accused the Martins of excessive noise during late hours. Daniel's stomach twisted when he read it, because the so-called noise was nothing more than his ambulance pulling into the driveway after a grueling midnight shift. He was saving lives, but in the HOA's eyes, he was just another disruption to their peaceful community. It didn't end there. Soon after, the Martins received notice of yet another fine, $500 for yard non-compliance. The issue? A single dandelion sprouting through a crack near the sidewalk. Sarah stood there staring at it in disbelief, her heart pounding in her chest. It was as if someone was waiting with a clipboard, documenting every microscopic imperfection on their property, and in fact, they were. One evening, as Sarah carried groceries from the car, she noticed Karen, the HOA president, walking slowly along the sidewalk in front of their home, holding a notepad. She wasn't subtle. She paused, scribbled something down, and glanced deliberately at the Martins' house before moving on. That was when Sarah realized this wasn't about fairness. This wasn't about rules. This was a targeted campaign. The Martins began to feel the walls closing in. Their once quiet evenings were now filled with tense conversations at the kitchen table, bills and citations scattered like landmines across the counter. "We can't keep paying this," Daniel muttered one night, running a hand through his hair. "They'll bury us if we let them." Sarah nodded, her voice cracking. "It's like they want us gone." And maybe they did. The harassment soon bled into daily life in ways the Martins never expected. Sarah went to pick up her kids from school, only to overhear another mother whispering, "That's the family the HOA keeps writing about." The Martins' names had become gossip, a subject of hushed conversations at block parties and neighborhood meetings they were never invited to. Even the children weren't spared. Sarah's son came home from the park one afternoon with tears in his eyes. Another kid had told him their house was the bad one because the HOA said so. That was the moment Sarah's frustration shifted into something sharper, anger. This wasn't just about lawns and mailboxes anymore. It was personal. It was about dignity. Daniel decided enough was enough. He called the HOA directly, demanding an explanation for the fines. But instead of answers, he got a cold, rehearsed voice on the other end. "All violations have been documented in accordance with the bylaws. Failure to comply will result in legal escalation." Legal escalation. The words hit like a punch to the gut. They were being treated like criminals in their own neighborhood. The Martins tried to fight back. Daniel attended the next HOA meeting, a crowded gathering in the community center. He walked in with a folder of documents, photos of their yard, receipts for repairs, proof that many of the so-called violations were fabricated or exaggerated. But the moment he started speaking, he could feel the hostility in the room. Karen sat at the front, chin high, her eyes locked on him with a smugness that spoke louder than words. Every time Daniel presented evidence, Karen brushed it aside. Every time he raised his voice, she tapped her pen impatiently, as if waiting for him to finish so she could dismiss him. When he finally sat down, frustrated and humiliated, another HOA member leaned into the microphone. "If the Martins don't like the rules," the man said flatly, "they're free to move." Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel clenched his fists, his face burning. Move? This was their home, their kids' school, their lives. They weren't just going to pack up and run because a power-hungry committee decided they didn't belong. The meeting ended with no resolution, only more contempt. And that night, as Daniel and Sarah sat on the couch in silence, they both realized something terrifying. The HOA wasn't just making things difficult, they were trying to break them. The escalation didn't slow. It accelerated. The Martins were soon hit with a violation notice claiming their driveway had cracks visible. From the street, Daniel walked outside in disbelief. The so-called cracks were nothing more than hairline marks in the concrete, barely noticeable unless someone bent down to examine them. Then came the letter about their fence. The wood was slightly weathered, the HOA claimed, and therefore not in compliance with visual standards. The fine, $1,000 unless repairs were made immediately. Each new demand felt more outrageous than the last, each fine heavier than the one before. Sarah stopped opening the mail altogether, her hands shaking too much to face the words inside. It reached a point where the Martins wondered if they could even afford to stay. The fines piled higher and higher, and while they tried to contest them, every attempt was met with stone-faced rejection. It was a battle they were losing, one paper cut at a time. But then, the breaking point came. One Saturday morning, Sarah stepped outside to find a bright orange notice taped to their front door. In bold letters, it read, "Final warning, non-compliance may result in foreclosure proceedings." Foreclosure. Sarah's knees nearly gave out. She tore the paper down, clutching it to her chest, heart racing so hard she thought she might faint. The HOA was threatening to take their home, their sanctuary, the place they had poured their savings, their memories, their lives into. When Daniel saw it, his face went pale. For the first time, the unshakable paramedic who had seen the worst of human tragedy looked truly defeated. "They can't do this," he whispered, but his voice carried no confidence. The Martins were cornered, trapped, and that's when Daniel made a decision. He wasn't going to let a group of petty tyrants destroy everything his family had built. He was done playing defense. It was time to fight back with everything he had. The tension had reached its peak. Neighbors whispered. Fines mounted. The threat of foreclosure hung over the Martins like a storm cloud ready to break. And as Daniel began planning his next move, one thing was certain. This wasn't just a dispute anymore. This was war. The Martins had endured months of harassment. Letters, fines, threats. Their reputation was dragged through the mud. Their children whispered about on the playground. Their very home, the place they'd built their lives, hanging in the balance of foreclosure papers taped brazenly to their front door. But what the HOA hadn't counted on was that Daniel wasn't just another homeowner. He was someone who had faced chaos, death, and emergencies that most people couldn't even imagine. He was a man who had spent his career running into danger, not away from it. And he wasn't about to let a handful of petty tyrants in pressed polo shirts destroy his family. That's when the Martins decided to strike back. Daniel began documenting everything, every fine, every letter, every absurd citation that had landed in their mailbox. He photographed the cracks in the driveway, the supposed violations, the ceramic owl that had started the spiral. He gathered witness statements from neighbors, who had also grown tired of Karen's iron fist but had been too afraid to speak out. And when he was finished, he took it all to an attorney. The lawyer's eyes widened as he sifted through the evidence. "They've crossed lines," he said simply. "Serious ones. Threatening foreclosure over this? Harassment? Selective enforcement? Abuse of authority? This is a case." For the first time in months, the Martins felt something they thought they had lost: hope. The turning point came at the next HOA meeting. It was supposed to be business as usual. Another evening of Karen wielding her clipboard like a weapon. Another round of public shaming for those who didn't meet community standards. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as neighbors shuffled into their seats, the air heavy with the unspoken fear that no one dared cross her. But this night would be different. Daniel and Sarah walked in together, a thick binder in Daniel's hands. The room quieted as they sat in the front row, their presence radiating a calm defiance. Karen smirked when she saw them. She thought she was about to break them once and for all. The meeting began. Usual business, landscaping budgets, parking, complaints. Then came the moment Karen had been waiting for. She cleared her throat, her voice carrying that familiar, sharp authority. "Before we conclude, I'd like to address ongoing non-compliance issues with the Martins property." The room stiffened. Whispers spread. Sarah's stomach knotted, but Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he stood. "Actually," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to silence the room, "I think it's time we addressed the real violations happening here." Karen blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Daniel opened the binder, holding up page after page of letters, photos, and documentation. "For months, my family has been targeted, harassed, singled out for rules that are not only petty but also inconsistently enforced. I have proof that other properties have the same conditions: lawns, driveways, fences, and yet they've received no fines, no threats. Why? Because this isn't about community standards. It's about power. It's about intimidation. And it ends tonight." A ripple spread through the crowd. For the first time, Karen's mask cracked. She shifted in her chair, her smirk faltering. "This is highly inappropriate," she snapped. "If you have a grievance, you can submit it. In writing." Daniel cut her off. "I already did. To my attorney, and to the county, and to the state housing authority. Because what you've been doing isn't just unethical, it's illegal." Gasps filled the room. Karen's face flushed crimson. She slammed her gavel against the table. "Out of order!" she barked. "This meeting will not tolerate baseless accusations." But Daniel didn't sit down. He pulled out the final piece of evidence, a letter signed by Karen herself, threatening foreclosure over the alleged fence violation. He read it aloud, his voice echoing in the room. This right here isn't a warning. It's extortion, and everyone here should know. If it can happen to us, it can happen to any of you." The silence that followed was deafening. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. For months, they had whispered behind closed doors, afraid to be next. Now, someone was standing up and exposing the truth. Karen tried to regain control. Her voice quivered with rage as she snapped, "This man is lying. He's twisting facts. He's dangerous to this community." But then, from the back of the room, another voice spoke. "No," an older neighbor said, standing slowly. "He's right." All heads turned. It was Mr. Alvarez, a retired teacher who had lived in Willow Creek since it was first built. She fined me for having the wrong kind of mailbox post. He said, I paid it because I was scared. Another neighbor stood. She threatened to tow my daughter's car because it was parked in the street overnight. And another, she told me if I didn't replace my shutters, I'd face a lien. One by one, voices rose. The fear that had kept them silent finally cracked, spilling into a wave of pent-up anger. The room, once ruled by Karen's authority, had turned against her. Karen's face twisted, her voice rising to a shriek. This is mob behavior. You people don't understand. Without rules, this community will collapse. You'll thank me when your property values... But her words were drowned out. Neighbors shouted back. The meeting dissolved into chaos. But for once, it wasn't directed at the Martins. It was aimed squarely at her. And then, Daniel revealed. The final blow. I don't think property values are going to be your biggest concern, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. Because as of today, my attorney has filed a lawsuit against you personally for harassment, abuse of authority, and violation of state HOA law. And I'm not the only one. Others here have already agreed to join. This isn't just my fight anymore. It's all of ours. The room erupted. Not in anger, but in applause. Karen's gavel slipped from her hand, clattering against the table. For the first time, the Queen of Willow Creek sat frozen, powerless. Her reign of intimidation shattered under the weight of her own arrogance. That night, the Martins left the meeting not as victims, but as leaders of a neighborhood that had finally found its voice. The fight wasn't over, the legal battle loomed ahead, but the tide had turned. The fear was gone, and as they walked home under the glow of the streetlights, Sarah whispered the thought that had been growing inside her since this all began. They thought they could scare us into silence, but all they did was wake us up. The storm had broken. The reckoning had begun. And in the weeks that followed, Karen would learn the hard way that the Martins weren't just another family to push around. They were the ones who would bring her down. The HOA meeting was only the beginning. The moment Daniel announced the lawsuit, Karen's facade began to crumble. For years, she had relied on fear, intimidation, and the belief that no one would dare challenge her authority. But now, not only had someone stood up, but others were, standing with him. Within days, more homeowners came forward. Stories of fines for trivial offenses poured out. A family was fined because their curtains weren't the approved color. An elderly widow was threatened with a lien because her front garden had too many plants. A single mother cited that her child's basketball hoop was visible from the street. The Martins' binder of evidence grew into a stack of testimonies and photographs, a collective voice that painted a damning picture of Karen's reign over Willow Creek. And when the lawsuit papers were formally delivered to her doorstep, Karen's bravado finally shattered. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as the envelope was handed to her. For once, the woman who had scrutinized everyone else's homes was the one exposed, the one being judged. The weeks that followed were filled with a tense kind of anticipation. On the surface, the neighborhood carried on as usual. Lawns were mowed, kids rode bikes, and mailboxes stood painted in their approved shades. But beneath the calm, a storm was brewing. Karen tried to fight back. She sent letters claiming the Martins' accusations were false, that the lawsuit was a baseless attack meant to destabilize community harmony. She knocked on doors, trying to rally support, but the once loyal neighbors now kept their distance. Too many of them had been burned by her before. Too many of them had felt the sting of her petty punishments. At the next HOA meeting, the difference was clear. Attendance was higher than ever. And while Karen still sat at the head of the table, clipboard in hand, her authority had evaporated. People spoke freely now, their words sharp, their questions pointed. When she tried to silence them, they didn't back down. They pushed harder. Her reign was over, even if she didn't admit it yet. The legal battle stretched on for months, as legal battles often do. Karen hired an attorney, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Selective enforcement of rules, threats of foreclosure over minor issues, harassment through repeated fines. Emails surfaced, showing Karen boasting about making an example of certain families to keep order. The court didn't see a woman protecting community standards. They saw someone abusing her power, wielding authority not for fairness, but for personal vendetta. In the end, the ruling came down hard. The judge declared the HOA's actions unlawful, the fines and foreclosure threats invalid. Not only that, Karen herself was held personally accountable for harassment and abuse of authority. She was ordered to pay damages to the Martins and several other families who had joined the case. The courtroom was silent when the ruling was read. Silent. Except for the sound of Karen's pen slipping from her hand as she realized the weight of what had just happened. She had lost. Completely. The news spread quickly through Willow Creek. Neighbors whispered, but this time it wasn't fear in their voices. It was relief. Vindication. The Martins returned home that evening to find notes slipped into their mailbox. Handwritten thank yous from people who had never dared speak out before. A bouquet left on their porch with a simple, "Cart, thank you for giving us our neighborhood back." For Sarah, it was the first time in months she felt like she could breathe again. No more waking up with dread at what might be in the mailbox. No more scanning the yard for imagined violations. She could let her children play outside without worrying that someone was watching with a clipboard. For Daniel, it was more than just relief. It was pride. He had stood up not only for his family, but for every neighbor who had been too scared to challenge Karen. And in doing so, he had proven something bigger. Bullies lose their power the moment people stop fearing them. But the fallout for Karen was brutal. Word of the lawsuit and judgment spread beyond Willow Creek, tarnishing her reputation. She was forced to step down as HOA president, not by choice, but by overwhelming demand. A new board was elected, this time made up of people determined to bring fairness and transparency back to the community. Karen, once the self-appointed Queen of Willow Creek, found herself isolated. Neighbors avoided her. Friends she once leaned on for support stopped answering her calls. Her power, built on fear and intimidation, had evaporated. In a way, her downfall was poetic. She had spent years nitpicking every detail of other people's lives, obsessed with perfection and control. And in the end, she lost everything because of her own flaws, her arrogance, her pettiness, her inability to see her neighbors as people rather than subjects. For the Martins, life slowly returned to normal. Sarah replanted her front garden, this time with bright flowers she had always wanted but never dared to display. Her daughter placed the ceramic owl back on the porch, no longer a violation but now a symbol, a reminder that something so small, once used against them, had sparked a fight that changed everything. Daniel took pride in mowing the lawn on his own terms, not because of a threat from a committee, but because it was his home, his yard. And when he came home late at night after long shifts, he parked his ambulance in the driveway without fear of another complaint. The neighborhood felt lighter, freer. The weight of constant judgment was gone, replaced with a sense of community that hadn't existed in years, and yet, beneath the relief, there was also a lesson. The Martins knew their story wasn't unique. Across the country, countless families lived under the shadow of HOAs or power-hungry neighbors who pushed their authority too far. They knew there were others still suffering in silence, afraid to speak up. That was why, when people asked Daniel what kept him fighting even when things seemed hopeless, His answer was simple. Because if we didn't, who would? They count on our silence. They count on our fear. The moment we stop giving them that power, they lose. His words spread through Willow Creek, sparking conversations at kitchen tables and over fences. And slowly, the culture shifted. The HOA, once feared, became accountable. Meetings were transparent. Rules were enforced fairly. And neighbors, no longer afraid of retaliation, began to look out for each other again. It didn't happen overnight, but change never does. Months later, as Sarah sat on the porch with her morning coffee, she watched her kids ride their bikes down the street, laughter echoing through the cul-de-sac. For the first time in a long time, she smiled without that lingering knot of anxiety. The nightmare was over. Karen's reign had ended, and Willow Creek had finally become what it should have been all along: a community. At the end of the day, this story wasn't just about one family versus an HOA. It was about what happens when people in power forget that rules are meant to protect, not control. When authority becomes a weapon instead of a shield. The Martins' victory wasn't just their own. It was a reminder for anyone who's ever felt trapped, bullied, or silenced in their own neighborhood. Because sometimes the only way to protect your home is to fight for it. So I'll leave you with this question. If it were your family, your home, your peace of mind on the line, how far would you go to defend it?